Since the release of Super Mario Bros. Back in 1993, really one of three things would happen when a video game movie came out. Oh, it's bad. See, you can't make movies based off of video games. Then every once in a while, you'd get one where it's like, oh, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the turning point. Video game movies actually can be good. And that would always be like, oh, it's finally happened. The curse is broken. But then probably almost a majority of the time, it's just it would come out and it doesn't really move the needle one way or another. It's just kind of fine. If you're a fan of the video game, you either love it or you hate it because it's either too faithful or not faithful enough. And if you're just a normal moviegoer, maybe you don't even notice that it exists. But it really has just been kind of an up and a down for video game movies since the early 90s. It all started in 1993 with the release of Super Mario Bros. This movie did not do well, and it didn't do well in pretty much any way you would want to take a look at it. It didn't make very much money. Critics didn't like it. Fans didn't like it. General audiences didn't like it. Personally, I love it, but that's a different story. I grew up with this movie, so it's a ton of nostalgia. And I think it plays better if you don't treat it like a Mario movie at all. So it's definitely an adaptation, not within the canon of the games. If video games are starting off at a base point of 0, okay, this is what people expect for a video game movie, the Super Mario Bros. Movie is going to drop that expectation. People are going to say oh, see, these aren't very good. And things are going to continue to kind of go down from there with the next movie that was released, which was Double Dragons. It came out the next year. It's a side-scrolling beat 'em up game. And it's an action movie, but it is super low budget and poorly acted, poorly written, poorly directed, and doesn't really kind of follow the actual story of the games either, which for general audiences, they really don't care. They just want a good movie. Unfortunately, they didn't get that with this one. Street Fighter is going to come out, and it's going to be kind of right there with Double Dragons. It's up a little bit. You get Raul Julia's performance in there as M. Bison. You get Jean-Claude Van Damme, hamming it up a little bit. But, it's still not getting up to where we were at the very beginning before Super Mario Bros. Came out. So the next video game adaptation would kind of, I think, push us up towards breaking even, and probably even just a little bit further up into the positive with the release of Mortal Kombat. Now, this movie had it all, right? It had an awesome song in it. People still play that song to this day. It didn't really have a ton of story to mess up, right? That first Mortal Kombat is just a fighting tournament game, and you just kind of don't overcomplicate things. Let people fight. It's got Goro in it, big four-armed guy. He looked awesome, and Johnny Cage was being Johnny Cage on top of everybody else doing their thing. Now, unfortunately for video games as a whole and for the Mortal Kombat series, the sequel to Mortal Kombat Annihilation, would come out just 2 years later in 1997 and just plummet any goodwill that movie had created. Remember how Johnny Cage was a high point in that first movie? They just kill him off immediately, within the first 5 minutes. Everything that was good about the last movie becomes not good, and everything that was not good about the last movie becomes just absolutely unbearable. Wing Commander will come out. It's not really going to change anything. Did you even know there was a Wing Commander movie? Did you even know that Wing Commander was a thing? It definitely is not a cultural milestone. 2001 was an interesting year for video game movies. We get Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, the first time where we really have this real big name actor attached to a character that's associated with video games. Essentially, she's being female Indiana Jones. As long as you don't try to mess it up too bad, you're going to be all right. So this one definitely brought things up a little bit. But 2001 also gave us a really weird movie to talk about, which is the first Final Fantasy movie that would ever be released, which is called Final Fantasy: The Spirit Within. The big thing about this movie when it was coming out is just how realistic all the characters looked. And it isn't like any of the games that have been released at this point. It's not like fantasy, like those earlier Final Fantasy games. It's not like steampunk or anything like Final Fantasy VII. I'm not super versed in that series, but I know enough to know this is not like any of the games. So fans didn't like it for that reason, but overall it was whatever. In 2002, Resident Evil comes out, and it's definitely well received for the time, especially. It's hitting a lot of those kind of Matrix vibes. It's got a lot of fun horror stuff in it, really, if we're going to be honest. I think that, it's pretty dated, and there's definitely parts to laugh at in it. Like the part where she kicks the dog is pretty funny. But overall, with general audiences, this one was pretty good, even though for fans of the series, it was just kind of a lot of like, oh yeah, that is from the games, that is from the games, but the story, the characters and everything, not so much. Things are going to kind of continue to just kind of stay at that same level. You know, we're above where we started, and people are kind of excited about video game movies a little bit here with the release of the sequel to Lara Croft Tomb Raider, which is called The Cradle of Life. It's not nearly as successful as the first one is, but you know, if you were a fan of that one, you know, this one was all right. 2003 is also going to see like the real first big gut punch from a recurring character that we're going to be talking about here on the timeline, a guy named Uwe Boll. This guy would just go in, get the rights for these movies and make them super cheap. Some people would argue that he was using them to get around different tax things that he was going to have to pay for. I'm not alleging anything. I don't want to get on this guy's bad side. In the past, Uwe Boll's known for, you know, beating up people who gave his movies bad reviews. Though to be fair, he was doing it in like a boxing ring. So, I mean, if you're going to beat up somebody, that's kind of the way to do it. The first movie he would put out was House of the Dead, which is a arcade shooter. And, you know, again, not super story heavy, but, you know, just the movie itself is awful. It doesn't matter what it's based off of. It's hard to get through. 2004, we'd see a bit of a bounce back, you know, with the release of Resident Evil Apocalypse. This is us getting started with this Resident Evil series. Eventually, everybody's going to get tired of it. But at this point, you know, they're still starting to kind of just find their footing. And we're getting some more video game stuff, right? Jill Valentine shows up. She's looking like she does in the game. People on like the Resident Evil subreddit are still like, she was the best. And it's like all she was doing was wearing a tube top. So, I mean, like, to be fair, that's what Jill was wearing in Resident Evil 3, the game. And so you're like, yeah, they kind of nailed it. Nemesis shows up. He's looking great. But Alice is still like the main character here. So it's still kind of a bit of like push and pull when it comes to arguing with the fans of the series. Though this one does make more money than the first one did. Uwe Boll's going to show up again with Alone in the Dark. Just another bad horror movie by this guy. I don't want to spend very much time even thinking about it, let alone talking about it. Doom comes out that year as well. The one starring The Rock and Carl Urban, right? So some people who definitely hit it big, you know, since then. It's also got Rosamund Pike in it too. Like, so yeah, it's got tons of people in it that really have had good careers. Those good careers, I don't think really rely on the success of this movie because outside of like a sequence where it's like the first person and everything, you'd be hard pressed to be like, yeah, it's like a video game. That same year, we also got a huge release when it comes to just video game movies, like how I remember them being presented with the release of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, which is in universe, is animated. So it's kind of running its own race. But, you know, it is one of those things where it's like, oh man, I remember everybody who liked that game just like ate that up. And it was on all of the TVs at Best Buy because it just looked so good. I, again, personally, not very invested in the series. Didn't really care one way or the other on this one. And to be honest, I don't think general audiences did either. Most of them didn't even notice probably that it came out. Uwe Boll is back at it again with Bloodrayne, a movie about a lady vampire. So, you know, you'd think, oh, that could be some good stuff. No, Underworld around this same time. But no, it's not good because, again, it's directed by Uwe Boll. Luckily for the genre of video game movies, though, there was another horror movie that came out that year, and that was Silent Hill. Though fans of the series might argue whether or not how faithful it was, I just think that it kind of lifted up just the perception of those movies, just again, because some of the people that are getting the cast for this thing. DOA, Dead or Alive, doesn't move the needle at all one way or another. In fact, I forgot it even came out until I was putting together this list. And then that brings us into 2007. In 2007, we get our third Resident Evil movie, Resident Evil Extinction. And this is really where that movie series is just like, we don't really care at all what happened in the games because it's like post-apocalyptic now. We don't ever get there in the games. It's very much like, oh, there's these weird bioterror attacks that keep happening everywhere, and we just kind of learn to live with it. The world is pretty normal in Resident Evil, like the game series, but not in the movies. Here it is just definitely like, it's kind of Mad Max and everything, and it was still doing really good for the movie series too. Though it was kind of taking a turn away from horror even more than I had before. There's a lot of kung fu and everything in here, so it is kind of splitting that audience a little bit when it comes to people who like the games, people who like the movies. 2007 also saw Uwe Boll doing another movie. This time he's taking the reins on a movie based off the game Postal, which is all about like a postal worker going postal, right? And so it's one of those things where it's like, it's pretty edgy just for edgy's sake and everything. Even the poster, right? It's like South Park. And it's like, Is it though? Is it? Just because something's inappropriate doesn't mean it's like South Park. It's so funny that in 2007, that was like the highest praise you could give to something like this. It's like South Park. A new series makes the jump to movies that same year with Hitman. Timothy Olyphant's in this. It's crazy how many of these like big actors who go on to have these huge roles like in TV and movies kind of had these little pit stops here in the video game movie realm. He shaved bald and everything. I think it was put together well enough where people are like, this is better than I thought a video game movie would be. Though when they're just comparing it to Postal, I don't blame them. Unfortunately, Uwe Boll is going to hit us with a twofer here in the year 2008 with In the Name of the King, A Dungeon Siege Tale, and Far Cry. We're really getting to the point where it's like, yeah, these are just kind of getting made for what, rental only? Again, just to kind of launder money because, Far Cry didn't even make $1 million in theaters. Those two movies had knocked down like the expectations of video game movies so bad that when Mark Wahlberg starred in Max Payne, like there were a lot of people who were like, hey, you know what? It's actually not that bad. Is that what people still think today? I don't know. It's a product of its time. And then we get another one of those in canon animated movies, but this time in the Resident Evil series. So now we're running two concurrent Resident Evil movie series. One's where it's just like all about Alice and has nothing to do with the games really. And then these ones that are taking place in the game universe. This is with Resident Evil Degeneration. Again, with this kind of thing, most people don't even see it coming. It's not changing anybody's opinion on video game movies as a whole. The next year, Street Fighter, The Legend of Chun-Li comes out. It's starring the girl from Smallville. She's not Chun-Li. She doesn't look like Chun-Li. She ain't doing Chun-Li stuff. And on top of everything, it's not good. Not very many people saw this, so you at least have that. But the people who did see it, this definitely would have been bringing down that opinion just a little bit. The next year with Tekken, again, we're just going to kind of be feeling it out, staying in that same spot. No harm, no foul, but definitely not raising stakes. Prince of Persia, I might argue, kind of would. This is definitely a movie that would not get made the way that it was back then. Jake Gyllenhaal playing a guy in Persia is definitely a casting choice that people would not make today. 2010 also brings us Resident Evil Afterlife. These movies are continuing to make money. Though, again, at this point, it's like their own thing. People are just like, yeah, we know what to expect with these Resident Evil movies. Nothing comes out in 2011, but in 2012 is the year of some really big horror franchises with another Resident Evil live action movie, Resident Evil Retribution, and another animated Resident Evil movie, Resident Evil Damnation. Neither of those are going to move the needle much, but unfortunately, the sequel to the Silent Hill movie, Silent Hill Revelation, is going to drop things a bit. It's adding in the iconic character of Pyramid Head, so, the people who were like, oh, he looks so cool, it's so awesome, and only wanted that were happy, but they were pretty much the only people. People who were really wanting it to tie into the lore and everything of the games, not that stoked. And people who were wanting a movie that just kind of made sense and was good, also left a little disappointed. 2013, we saw the release of the movie Moshi Monsters, the movie. I mentioned this one here because I have no idea what this game is. I have no idea what the movie is. Maybe it was a hit overseas or something, or it just came out overseas. But this is just kind of one of those things where like, this is how much it doesn't move the needle. Again, I had no idea this even existed. 2014 comes out, Need for Speed starring Aaron Paul is in there. This is one I remember when it came out, people were like, you know what? It's not that bad. Like I specifically remember reading articles where people are like, for a video game movie, this is pretty good. So I think that would be moving that needle up just a little bit. But again, the reputation of video game movies is going to get knocked down by a sequel that just probably shouldn't exist with Hitman Agent 47. No Timothy Olyphant on this one. It's definitely been recast. Now, personally, 2016 is going to be the big turnaround for me. And it all started with a movie called Warcraft. Now, Warcraft here in the United States did not do particularly well, but it did great overseas. The movie made like over $400 million. And there's always been talks of like, oh, are they going to do a sequel and everything? I don't know if we'll ever get one. But I actually personally liked it. I'm not, again, huge on Warcraft or World of Warcraft, so I don't know a ton on like how faithful things are. But when it just came to being like a fantasy movie, I thought it was fun. And so as that kind of a person coming into it, it raised those expectations for me. And then we're going to kind of hit this spell where it's going to just kind of be like, okay, is this what video game movies are? Just kind of fun. All right, this is what we can expect. We get Assassin's Creed. Some people really like it. Some people didn't like it. I don't think it really kind of changed those expectations. Ratchet and Clank, it's animated, so it doesn't kind of get to move the bar quite as much. But this is one where I definitely remember people just being like, yeah, that was a pretty good movie. The Angry Birds movie, not maybe as high cinema as some of this other stuff is hoping to be, but it was very successful, enough to get a sequel. Resident Evil, the final chapter comes in. This is kind of tying up all those loose ends in that live action Resident Evil series. They're cutting out at the right time on this one. And it's just so wild and crazy. We're going to continue to get even more of those Resident Evil animated movies too in here with Resident Evil Vendetta. 2018 might be another year where we could see like a slight uptick. I think we see some positive movement, even if it's just a little bit, with the release of, Tomb Raider and with a Rampage. Specifically with Rampage, again, just kind of being like, okay, it's not exactly what the games are, but those games are just about like smashing buildings and everything anyway, and they do plenty of that in this movie. The Rock is being The Rock in there before being The Rock was obnoxious or as obnoxious, so that's nice. So we're riding into 2019 on like a pretty good spot. Like, it's definitely not every video game movie is bad. But then we get a huge one with Pokemon Detective Pikachu. Not only is this the first Nintendo-related franchise to get a movie since the Super Mario Bros. Movie back in 1993. They've been very much like hands off all that stuff. We don't want anybody wrecking anything. But also Pokemon is like the biggest thing in the entire world and has been for like over 10 years at this point. And there have been animated movies that have been coming out, but they're based on the anime, so I'm not including them on this list at all. But this one is just based on the games, and it is ginormous. It's not universal praise, but it's definitely a situation where it's like, hey, this is fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, and to some people that means a lot. But also to like the fans and everything, it's like, oh, this is kind of cool to see all these semi-realistic Pokemon. Kids loved it. I don't know, it just was a good time overall. And it's a good time in like a step above what we had seen up to that point. The Angry Birds movie is fine, just being a sequel. It's kind of meeting that expectation that you had from the first one. Sonic the Hedgehog comes out in 2020. I feel like if Detective Pikachu hadn't come out, this would have been an even bigger deal, but it really just kind of met that and maybe just took it up just a little bit. I think the reason that I consider it such a success is because of how much it almost wasn't, right? With all that bad Sonic CGI that first came out when the movie first had its trailer. It's just like a miracle that it came back around. It was all good and has started a successful franchise. It hasn't been flawless though since the release of Detective Pikachu. Monster Hunter came out. It's one that I would say most people don't even remember, but fans were not impressed with how this one came to be, with modern military stuff being thrown in there, which is definitely not a part of that series. It's from the same team as the Resident Evil movies, which is why we shouldn't be surprised why it's not like the game. But still, it's a bit disappointing. 2021, we get another crack at a couple different series. For starters, Mortal Kombat. This one wins it back from Annihilation for sure. And most people would even say it's better than the original. It finally was getting into that violence that people expected from that series. Like, that's part of Mortal Kombat, is like, how bloody is it going to be? This movie did not shy away from that stuff. And then they also took another go at the Resident Evil series with Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. This one is very bad. I was making YouTube videos when this one came out. I was excited. I thought the trailers looked pretty good. Lisa Trevor, the Liquor's in there. It's got all the original characters, but they're squeezing in two games into one movie. Oh, that's not good. Oh, it turns out that the movie's really, really bad. It's like the cheapest looking thing I've ever seen. Oh my gosh, I don't like this at all. We did get one of the best received, at least critic-wise, video game adaptations with Werewolves Within, which is an adaptation of like one of those like murder card games that you can play like when you're at camp. I haven't seen this one, but I hear it's pretty funny. So the director is great. He's a guy that's on like Dropout TV. With 2022 comes the release of Uncharted. Now, for some people, I guess this one didn't play well for them. I thought it was kind of fun, right? I think that for general audiences, it did well. Given the time that it was released, and how close it was to like the pandemic and everything, I think that the fact that it broke $400 million is pretty good. Now, the characters are definitely a bit different than they are in the game, so people who are really wanting that, I definitely understand. But I thought it was a fun time. Mark Wahlberg showing up in these things again. And Tom Holland as Nathan Drake is a choice. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 came out that year as well. I think that's better than the first one even. It's definitely just kind of leaning into all of the video game stuff even more. And it worked out for him. It made more money than the first one. So if you're just looking at video game movies at this point, things are doing pretty good. But this is where we have to introduce like a little bit of a wild card into the situation. That's the release of the shows that these streaming services started to put out. We had 2 big shows based on video games that came out this year: Resident Evil on Netflix and Halo on Paramount Plus. The thing that both of these had in common is that they were bad. I watched the first episode of both of these shows. I had no desire at all to continue watching past that. I'm not somebody who is going to just hate watch something. Life is too short to do that kind of stuff. And even though those are not movies, I think that those both kind of brought down the video game adaptation talk in general, especially with it being like these 2 huge franchises. I mean, there was a ton of hype behind the Halo show. We had been waiting for a Halo movie or show to come out for so long. And there's a lot in that show that looks great, but it's just like the character stuff. Like, why are you always changing these characters so much? Like, people like Master Chief. Like, just let Master Chief be in the show the way that he is in the game. Last year, 2023, was, I'd say, a really good year for video game adaptations. You had the Five Nights at Freddy's movie come out. Not for me. I'm not the key demographic in there. Watched the movie. The worst thing that was kind of boring. I didn't think it was awful. And in keeping the PG-13 rating, it was able to kind of stick with its key audience. Of course, there's like those edgelord people who are like, it's got to be bloodier, it's got to be grosser. It's like, yeah, but like, remember, this is a series for kids and they want to make $1 billion. They didn't quite get to the billion, but they did make quite a bit. Enough to greenlight that sequel like pretty much right away. 2023 did give us a $1 billion movie though, with the Super Mario Bros. Movie. And this is really where I think it's like, okay, we don't have to think of these things as different than other kinds of adaptations at this point. They can be this successful. Sure, it's a kid's movie. Sure, it's a cartoon, but it's like the ultimate redemption for video game movies. That first one that came out in 1993, 30 years later, here is another one. And guess what? It's, doing all the things that that original one didn't. It's very much like the games. It's got the music. It's got the characters being those characters. It's what you want it to be. And the biggest problem that people had with it is that it's too much like a kid's movie. The story is too simple. It's like, again, it's for kids. It's okay that it's simple. Not everything has to be like crazy deep. Know your audience, give them what they want. That's what they did. They made over $1 billion. We get another one of those tried and true Resident Evil CG movies, this time bringing in like all of those key characters with Resident Evil Death Island. And then video game TV show adaptations hit a high point too with The Last of Us. Twisted Metal also comes out. I think it just kind of skates by. People don't really notice it, but it does fine. Right? Anthony Mackie is cool. Sweet Tooth looks great. Though I don't know why you're not letting Samoa Joe do the voice. It's not like he can't act. And then we slide into this year, 2024. Fallout, again, crushed it. The Knuckles show came out. Whatever, it's fine. And then Borderlands coming out. Hey, real quick, coming in, editing Seth. I hadn't seen Borderlands when I recorded this video. It did not just come out. It was just awful. Decimated by reviewers. Still waiting to hear on the box office. I'm willing to bet it's not going to be great. But yeah, I think overall it probably is going to bring down people's opinions a little bit, though it doesn't change my opinions on kind of the overall state of video game movies I'm going to talk about here in the rest of the video. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in here so that I didn't sound like an idiot just being like, yeah, and then Borderlands came out, I guess, because definitely didn't just come out. It definitely crashed and burned. So, yeah, I mean, overall, I think video game adaptations is in a really good spot. Like with the last few years with Mario and The Last of Us and Fallout, it's like all of those different kinds of games that we would want to see adapted are doing well. Like there's a movie that's aimed at kids. There's a show that's aimed at adults and it's super serious. And then there's a show that's aimed at adults and it's like fun and an adventure and kind of a comedy. And they all did well and they were all well done. And so it's almost like at this point, video game adaptations are like any other kind of adaptation, like a book. It's like, okay, you can do it well, or you can do it poorly. And it doesn't matter that it's based on a video game. It could be either of those things. And it's kind of cool to be there. It's kind of cool to be at that point. Are we going to stop seeing those videos and articles getting posted where it's like, finally, the first good video game adaptation? I hope so. I think at this point, there's enough good things where it's like, hey, we can point to like 4 things at this point. It used to be like, well, what about Mortal Kombat, like the original? But now it's like, hey, what about the Super Mario Bros. Movie? Hey, what about The Last of Us? Hey, what about Fallout? There's just a lot of examples of it being done well. It's been interesting to kind of look back and see how these adaptations have kind of come into their own. And it's kind of right alongside those comic book adaptations, right? People who grew up enjoying that medium, finally getting the chance to, be in charge of those things because of, with age, they've aged up into it. And it's like, okay, now people who know what these things are about can do them and they're in charge. And so you get some of these more faithful adaptations that, do well. If you're a fan of video games and you want to see them adapted into good movies, I don't think you've ever had better odds of that happening than you do right now.